couple things just to know in terms of your engagement, because, well, I have some really, really thoughtful, insightful questions. We really want to hear from you as well. So you probably saw the note cards by the elevator. If you didn't get a chance to grab a note card and you have questions, we have somebody holding their hand up over there. Just sort of wave at them and let them know you want to ask a question. They'll bring you a card. Once it's done, wave it again. Someone will come around and collect it. That way we can make sure to collect the questions and get them answered. I will intersperse your questions with mine so that we can really have a lively conversation tonight. So, welcome.
Thank you.
So, you're a multifaceted guy. In addition to all the entrepreneurial credentials, an award-winning composer, accomplished musician, record producer, literally 20 years plus, I think, experience in the music industry. Quite a background. So tell us how the entrepreneurial journey started for you, right? Because I assumed did not go to college going, hey, someday I'm going to start a company, right? So how did the genesis of the idea for what has ultimately become Pandora happen? Like, what is that early startup story? Let's start there.
Sure. So yeah, I didn't have the typical pre-business resume. I graduated college in 1988. I was an undergrad at Stanford, so I was surrounded by a bunch of very career-minded people. But my first job out of college was a nanny. Actually, Manny is what they call it.
Oh, I have a 5-year-old. That's good to know.
I was a Manny for 5 years. That was my first job. Not really training for entrepreneurship, although actually it's great training for managing people. So some of the things I learned managing 8- and 9-year-olds came in handy later on.
We might come back to that.
But I wound up spending my 20s playing music, basically, playing in rock bands for a long time, living out of a van and sort of being in and among this sort of world of working musicians. And when I grew tired of that, I became a film composer, so I wrote music for picture. And that's really where the idea kind of came to me. As a film composer, your job is to understand a director's film, music taste rather. And so I would, typically the way you make a movie is the movie gets done, it has sound effects, dialogue, and it's called a locked picture, and no music. And you sit with the director and watch the movie and talk about the music. And I would do that and play songs. I'd bring a stack of CDs with me and we'd play music, and I would use that to profile their preferences and understand what they wanted. And I got pretty good at that. I could glean some good musicological information. And one day I was living in the Bay Area's late 90s, 1999, the very apex of the .com, euphoria. And I had an idea. I read an article in a newspaper one day, and the idea just came to me, which was to try to kind of codify this method of profiling taste and create a taxonomy of music taste, and then by marrying it to mathematics, build a sort of a music recommendation engine. So it was an idea that kind of just popped into my head.
So when did you turn that point from idea to there's a company here?
A few months ago. So I had the idea, and I probably would have sat on it and not done anything. I didn't imagine myself as someone who started companies. That seemed very not something that I did. My then fiance, now wife, was very encouraging and said, "That's a really interesting, novel idea. You ought to do something with it." And in spite of being surrounded by this entrepreneurial explosion, I just kind of sat on it for a few months. But then I shared the idea with a former college classmate, a guy named John Kraft, a longtime friend, and who had already sort of been through the full life cycle of a startup. And he said, "Wow, that's a really interesting idea. You could probably build a company on that." And I said, "Oh, great, it's interesting." He said, "Let's go do a business plan." I said, "How do you do that?" And I think a week or two after I shared the idea, we spent a weekend together and wrote a business plan. And then literally a couple of weeks later, we were out pitching it to investors. I'd never done any of that before. And 2 months later, we had $1.5 million to fund this completely harebrained idea. And 2 weeks later, the whole .com thing ended. The door slammed shut behind us, basically.
Talk about sneaking in under the wire. So, what was that like? You clearly, you had a little bit of capital to have a runway, so you were in better position than many companies at that time. But what was that like in the post-crash era, and through the pressure that ensued from investors, and how do we really drive scale? It was a different time.
Yeah, well, the first part was euphoric. You know, you have $1.5 million. Like I'd never, the idea that I have $1.5 million is just so unimaginable to me. And we rented a studio apartment in South San Francisco, like everybody else was doing. It had big, thick, speckled black shag carpeting. I still remember. And we hired a few software engineers and a handful of musicians, and then just began in a big whiteboard and just started creating this music genome project and the sort of the taxonomy and the algorithms around it. And it was a blast. You know, we were up all night and spent a few months kind of just developing the idea, and then started to build it, which had sort of two arms. There was a music arm, which I ran, and then the software side run by a guy named Will Glazer, who was our sort of third co-founder. And then we kind of brought those together. And that took about 4 or 5 months to kind of form the idea, and then about those 6, 7, 8 months to have sort of a prototype. And that was just a blast that whole time. It was really fun.
So, fast forward a decade. The company is a success, you have an IPO, a lot happened in that timeline, right? It wasn't just all hockey stick from there forward. Give us a taste of what that journey was like, both in terms of some of the euphoric moments of success, but also, frankly, some of the challenges, right? Because how many people in the audience are entrepreneurs building startups, right? So you've got a lot of people in the community here that are interested in what that journey is like. They hope to have a similar journey, so I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, we didn't have a straight path to here, that's for sure. So that first year was wonderful and euphoric, and we built this product, and we had a very cool little prototype that ran on a sort of a little, actually, after a year, we had built a prototype. It was a music a recommendation tool, and what we had done is we had built this taxonomy, hundreds of musical attributes, and hired a bunch of musicians to manually score these songs, one attribute at a time, song by song. So taking 20 or 30 minutes to do this detailed analysis of an individual song. Could be an hour or more for a symphonic piece. And we're doing that one song at a time. And we were doing it literally on pencil and paper, kid you not. And then we transferred all of those numbers into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet.
We're talking MVP here, people.
And after about a year, the product was a spreadsheet with about 10,000 songs, and their musical analysis entered in a spreadsheet. So 10,000 rows, 300 columns, and you could pick any song in this 10,000 song collection, entered in the sort of source box, and hit rank. And a Microsoft Excel macro would compute the distance from that song and rank order the rest of the songs from closest to furthest away by essentially computing the aggregate distance between each score. We call them genes, each musical gene. They were all weighted as well, so it was a weighted distance, and then rank order them. And so about a year in, we had our first version of this thing, and so I remember like it was yesterday, sitting down like, okay, we're gonna try this thing. And we typed in a Beatles song, and then we hit rank, and it took like 3 minutes for the macro to churn through this calculation. And we waited with bated breath for the list to pop out, and the first song that shows up is a Bee Gees tune. And we're like, oh fuck, it doesn't work after all this, like a year in, and bam, Turns out though the song was actually, it was an early Bee Gees song, which was, before they became a big disco sensation, they were essentially a knockoff Beatles band. And the song was a perfect dead ringer for the song we'd chosen, so it turned out to be really working. And we went from like depression to euphoria in 2 seconds. So a good moment there, but by that time we had begun to see the trouble ahead. And we had gone out to test the waters and try and think about raising another round, and it was clear it was not going to be as easy as it was the first time. basically, Silicon Valley was closed for business. Sand Hill was. And so knowing that as 2001 began, we began asking our employees to take a smaller and smaller share of their salary in cash. Until by the end of '01, we weren't paying our employees anything at all. We called that salary deferral back then, which, by the way, is illegal in California, for those of you who are thinking about doing that. And back then, we actually could have gone to jail for it, I learned later on. But about 50 people worked without salary for about 2 years on this music genome project and the associated technology. So, by the end of '03, I had 11 maxed out credit cards. And I remember actually being on my dining room table, and I had all my credit card bills. I hope none of you have ever had this experience. And you're trying to sequence your minimum payments, like figure out when they're due. It's like a game of Tetris. Like what do I pay next, and how much? Using sometimes one card to pay a minimum payment on another. It's awful.
At this point, your then wife is saying, "What was I thinking when I told them to pursue this idea?"
So believe it or not, she never did that. She was always the one who like, suck it up, just keep going. She was really supportive, in a supportive way. She said that. Anyways, I owed hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt by the end of '03, and I had pitched Pandora 348 times before I got our second round of financing in March of '04, 4 years after the first round of financing. So we went through kind of a trial by fire, a couple of years of really stressful, sleepless, crazy, irrational time. And then things got better. In March of 2004, we raised $9 million. I'm still not quite sure how that happened. Actually, I do know. The guy who raised it was a drummer, so he wasn't all there. I think that's why it happened. God bless him. Larry Marcus led this round. We paid everybody back, so everybody was made whole. So the day after we raised the money, we had an all-hands meeting at what was then called Savage Beast Technologies. And no one knew we had raised that money because I had sort of decided to not kind of do this sort of ongoing updating of the fundraising efforts because it's just depressing. And you keep thinking you're close, but you're never as close as you think. So I said, I'm not saying a word till the money's in the bank, and the wires had come in the night before. So we all sat down for the all-hands meeting, and everybody's like, okay, here comes the work for nothing for 2 more weeks pep talk from Tim. And instead I was like, pulled out this huge wad of envelopes and slapped it down on the table, and I get goosebumps saying it even now, and handed out $1.8 million of salary in one all-hands meeting.
Lots of happy dancing going on that day.
It was an intense moment. So made everybody whole, and then we had sort of a new life. We had not figured out a business. We tried to license it, to all sorts of different entities. We've been in the kiosk business. It was nutty, and we essentially did the classic pivot. And we realized, looking at the technology, I hired a fantastic new CEO named Joe Kennedy who helped take us through this, and we saw this opportunity in radio and realized, oh man, we could take this same technology and repurpose it, and it's, in hindsight, is built for personalized playlists. And a little over a year later, we launched Pandora. And I remember when I first saw the first version of Pandora, it was then called One-Click Custom Radio. When I saw it, I was like, that's home, this is where we should have been all along. And then it took off like a rocket ship.
Custom made too for the technology changes, almost as if technology caught up to what it was you had envisioned, right? It was finally in our hands, in our pockets, ready for us to access that, right? So,
well, the in our pockets thing happened a couple years later with a smartphone, but certainly the broadband growth in those intervening years is what opened up the opportunity for us. Internet radio in 2000 was kind of, over dial-up, it was crappy, but over broadband, you could really do it.
yeah. So talk about, the Pandora story is not complete with a conversation around the engagement with the musicians and sort of that was a massive shift for the music industry to be thinking about this business model and what does that do for them. Talk a little bit about that relationship and how you managed to convince them, to work with you, and what was that journey like?
Well, it's been a rocky road since we launched Pandora. So it's a brand new. So the music industry is going through some pretty fundamental changes. Starting with the demise of the CD sale. Clearly, the move from a CD to a single, from a bundled $20 product to a 99-cent product, really it undermined and continues to undermine the revenue stream of the business. So there are things popping up in its place, obviously. And it's a very, very emotional period of time for the industry, for everybody, and certainly for musicians who, I remember when I was in a band, we were still trying to sell CDs. A lot of musicians I talk to now are not really focused on that, so they're trying to figure out how else do I do it. And so it's an emotional moment, emotional time, and we are spending a lot of time communicating and explaining and giving context to what we're doing. I think there are a few things about internet radio that are just particularly powerful, and I think make it a bright spot in this otherwise pretty frightening time. The first is that internet radio pays performers, which broadcast radio doesn't pay. So about half of our revenue goes to performers, the people actually singing or playing the music. They're not compensated by that on AM/FM, so every hour that moves from broadcast radio to internet radio, us or any other web radio, is a whole new, it's essentially allowing the industry to participate really in the biggest part of the business, which is advertising, radio advertising. That I think is a huge positive move. The second thing is, because it's a connected form of radio, we have the ability, we have a knowledge of each listener. We know what they like, we know where they live, their demographics, and we have the ability to communicate with them. And so I think what is ahead for us, and this has actually we've begun to deliver on this, is turning this into a sort of a CRM platform for musicians where they can harvest this audience on Pandora. And just a few months ago, we published this thing called Pandora Amp, just released it, and I think close to 3,000 artists have already signed up for it. And artists can log in now, essentially claim their identity on Pandora, and then have access to all the information on the platform. So be able to look up sort of all their songs that are playing, the spins, the thumb up and thumb down information, the demographics. Literally, they can see their thumb up audience plotted on a map of the US. And eventually, they'll be able to literally message and communicate with people through this. So, hey, I'm coming to DC next Thursday. You'll be a listener in Washington walking down the street, you'll thumb up a song, and when the song ends, that artist will come on saying, hey, glad you liked our music, we're playing in DC on Thursday. Click the banner to RSVP or something. So I think this has the potential to really change what is the single biggest challenge facing your average working band, which is how do you market yourself when you don't have a big marketing machine behind you? That's what we can become.
So I'm going to intersperse a couple of questions from the audience that I think are sort of relevant to what you just talked about. So, one of the audience members wants to know, what are some of the obstacles you face in doing a better job of targeting the ads? What are some of the obstacles there?
So the information that we have essentially is gender, age, and zip code plus the music you're listening to. So those 4 attributes are part of Pandora's registration and user behavior, and we can use and do use those to target almost every single ad. So right now, there's not a campaign on Pandora that doesn't have some target around it. So I want to reach, women in their 40s in the New York metropolitan area listening to country, That's probably a small number.
All 3 of them.
But you can segment, and those 4 attributes all by themselves, as far as advertisers go, get you like 80% of what they really need. It allows us to operate not just as a national sales platform, but as a local platform too. And we're now the largest radio station in every city and town in the US, in some cases by a large margin. And so we have local sellers in 40 markets now that are selling local ads on Pandora to local businesses. So targeting is a huge part of this, and I think it's what will make this a more efficient advertising business than even AM/FM has been.
That's great. So another question, will Pandora begin allowing users to design their whole feed based on saved tracks?
Does that mean their own playlist, do you think?
Likely. Do we have the person who answered this
Their own
question?
playlist? Yeah. Yes, so we operate under a compulsory license, meaning it's a license granted by the government that allows us to operate as a radio product. So there's some limits to how much customization we're allowed to do. So if we do too much, we wind up not really being a radio, we're more like an on-demand service. So we have to sort of stay under that umbrella. And so too much customization we'd run afoul of that license. So we can't offer that level of control for a user. Yeah.
Darn government. So somebody wants to know the secret sauce. What is Pandora's formula for categorizing tracks?
So the Music Genome Project, which powers this, there are two ingredients now. One is the genome. So now it's about 450 attributes per song, as many as 450. And those attributes are essentially every detail of melody and harmony and rhythm and form and instrumentation and vocal performance and lyric. It's like the equivalent of musical primary colors. So we understand the vocal, we analyze the vocal along, I think, 17 or 18 attributes, just to understand the sound of the voice. And if you put all those attributes together, that's what forms the sound of a song. And the nice thing about this approach is it's blind to popularity. So if you type a song in and we match it to another song based on its musical similarity, we literally don't know if that song is a hit song or something from a completely unknown artist. And the vast majority of the music in our collection are from lesser known bands. So it's a great discovery platform, for musicians. So the Music Genome product is that first piece. And then on top of that, we layer thumbs. And we just crossed a 50 billion thumb threshold for listeners. Like, you guys love to thumb. Actually, how many people here have used Pandora? Okay, cool.
Shame on you, those who have not. Let's shame them.
You know what? I kind of knew that'd be true, but I like to see the hands go up. I have to confess.
Should we do it one more time, really, really high? Everyone a thumb up.
So when you thumb a song, two things happen. One, it curates that station just for you, just that station and just for you. So if you thumb down a song, that song never plays again, and we start to prune the tree around that song. We also take that thumb and we add it to the aggregate behavior of people who have listened to that same song on that same station. So we may learn over time that if you start a Blues Traveler station and we play this Matchbox 20 song, it gets overwhelmingly thumbs down, we'll take it out for everybody. And so we now have this really sophisticated combination of Music Genome Project and essentially wisdom of the audience. Over time, it's really started to perfect it. And the fastest growing function on our engineering team are data scientists. We are hiring people that are interested in finding patterns in large numbers. And we hired a woman recently whose PhD was on learning behavior in rats. And then a guy from NASA who was studying some kind of, I don't know, don't understand it. But this cadre of people who are really interested in big data. And it's amazing the power of it, And we've noticed, for example, that people who launch a Springsteen station in New Jersey have different preferences than people who launch it in California. Kind of makes sense, there's history there. And all these different things you begin to see emerge out of data, so we're trying to kind of make it smarter over time.
We had a similar question from another person who just prefaced it by saying Pandora is awesome, so I want to make sure you know that. So, interesting question. How did you decide on the name Pandora, and what's in the box?
So, it was the last available URL. No, actually, ironically, it was an Apple engineer owned it and was squatting on it. We bought it from him for 15 grand. Good luck buying a 3-syllable URL for that amount of money now. We just went through kind of a typical naming process where the team kind of threw out ideas. We consulted, all the usual dictionaries and thesauruses, and of course, Greek mythology. And Joe actually is the guy who suggested the name, and I think when we all heard it, we thought, oh, that's a nice sounding name. And then of course we liked the myth behind it. But mostly we like the fact that it's a box full of surprises, you know. And she's curious, she has to open it, but she doesn't know what's going to come out. Now, death, pestilence, and famine come out of the box. That's not we're trying to evoke that. But there was does anyone know what was at the bottom of the box? Hope. Exactly. We like that little twist on the story. So yeah, it feels good, and it's easy to remember and easy to spell, which is really important.
I'm thinking of the analogies, though, between startup life, like hope and pestilence, and then, you know, you sort of go through death and famine and pestilence, and then hope. So,
I never thought about that. We mirrored our trajectory.
Yeah, maybe some little thinking there.
Yeah.
So really serious question here. Does Bruno Mars sing at Pandora HQ?
She's referring to a Saturday Night Live skit.
Yeah, so what was your reaction to the SNL's Pandora skit?
Oh, that was the best.
What did it mean to the company? Was it symbolic for you guys?
Well, so we got the call from their production crew that they wanted some Pandora logos and things, and we thought, oh crap, like we're gonna get nailed on Saturday Night Live, and like who's gonna be the idiot on, you know, who's gonna get roasted on Saturday Night Live? And instead it did fantastic, that funny thing. Everybody in the company, everybody was watching that show live to see what it would be, and it was a great boost for everyone. It was really fun, and we wrote him and wrote the crew, and it was really fun. But although, you know, we've had a lot of press coverage over the years, and you know, print and on screen, etc. The only press hit that materially changed our growth trajectory was Doonesbury. So we were the subject of 2 consecutive Doonesbury cartoons, and you can go in and see on our growth path a beep where the Doonesbury article hit. Kind of interesting.
Funny. Doonesbury and Saturday Night Live, the key to your startup's growth, right there. So let's bring it back a little bit to the startup journey. I think it's a great question here. When, if ever, did you worry about someone taking your concept and doing it better?
Well, you worry all the time about competition when you're a young company. And there were a handful of companies doing very similar things. There was maybe 12 or 15 companies back then trying to tackle music recommendation from different angles. No one was quite using our approach, but there were similar things. And yeah, we were paranoid about that and worried about it all the time. Although in hindsight, what I've come to really believe about businesses is, you know, execution is really what drives success. A lot of companies have similar ideas, but the ability to actually sustain yourself, you know, hire a team, hang on to a team, sort of navigate through the sort of hundreds of things that come at you as a company, like that far outweighs a sort of differentiation of the idea itself. My guess is, I would just talk with, I think, 7 or 8 entrepreneurs here, with all very interesting ideas. I'll bet there are 3 or 4 companies doing almost exactly the same thing somewhere else as they are. Don't be discouraged by that, people that I met. And I think it really comes down to who really can execute, because I think that's where most companies fail, frankly. You know, they fall apart because their leadership team disintegrates, or they make bad decisions with money. You know, they hire the wrong people. Their culture collapses, those kinds of things. It's not like the basic idea is just as good as the other one, but they didn't execute well.
So when you're building your team, talk about what you looked for in those people. You had an enormous sense of loyalty among that team, being willing to work for so long without being paid, and sort of the passion that's there. Talk about what you looked for. How did you know you had the right people?
Boy, when we first hired, you know, we didn't hire asking ourselves, could these guys work for 2 years without salary? You know, we didn't imagine anything that was ahead of us. But I would say that we certainly hired, by and large, people that we knew in the beginning. So people I've worked with before, and hired people they liked a lot personally, trusted and felt were really good human beings. And then we kind of over-invested in company culture, even as a young company. We spent a lot of time internally, spending time with people. We were very transparent about the business, making everybody sort of feel like an owner in the company. So no one was surprised by anything. I think everybody felt pretty respected. And I think once you do that, when you inevitably hit your first kind of, a rough patch, I think companies can go one of two ways. When things get tough, you can either rapidly come apart, or the hard stuff makes you stronger. You kind of like circle the wagons. And I think that happened to us. So it was tough, but people kind of came together around it. And then after a while, what happens is you're working and you're going not for the company so much as for everybody else who's doing it with you, which I think is a common phenomenon in lots of arenas. And I remember, I had no choice. I was literally going to do this till I dropped dead, Like, I had convinced everybody to come and do it. I had convinced all these folks to loan us money. There was no way I was ever going to stop doing that. But I think that a lot of people stuck around because they felt an intense loyalty to each other. And so that kept this core team of people together long enough to survive.
So if you had to do over again, what would you do differently?
Oh boy. It's funny because in some ways, I don't feel like we had tons of choices back then. If I go back and say, we chose to do this instead of that, I sort of feel like we were forced to just sort of deal with this sort of endless flow of emergencies. I think the thing I would, in this particular experience, I would have spent less time raising money. I pitched Pandora so many times, and it's a very, it really takes a lot of energy. It's discouraging, it's not like you get positive feedback from investors. I got a lot of long no's, which is the worst thing. If anybody's an investor out there, don't give the long no, give the quick no. Long no's are killers. And I think that time would have been much better spent inward focused, but it was so hard when no one was getting paid to not be out there hustling for money all the time. So I kind of felt compelled to do it. That's one of the biggest things I would change.
So we have a room full of entrepreneurs who, have their own ideas and are scaling their own companies. What would you tell them to do and not do, right, for their own experiences and journey?
I think the first thing I'd say is, don't do it alone. So I don't know how many people are solo entrepreneurs, but boy, I don't recommend that. Find at least one person to be your partner. And when you do that, find someone who is fundamentally complementary to you. So when you're small, you do not have the luxury of redundancy. Your team needs to be absolutely 100% efficient. So you need someone who's all about software, someone who's all about marketing, some design. Have really clear areas of expertise that are compatible and are additive, and be ruthless about letting go of people if they don't fit that standard of efficiency. That's a very hard thing to do when you're a young company. If you're like 6 people or 5 people, so many companies, like one partner, one founder, kind of sort of starting to be a little bit redundant or creating some problems. You gotta excise that as fast as you can. It's hard, but it'll save you a lot of heartache. The second thing I'd say is create a sustainable life for yourself. So it will take longer than you think, probably a lot longer than you think, and I think a lot of people view it as a sprint, and they get so buried in it, their personal life gets put to the side for a while, and it's like, it's an anaerobic exercise, and you need to create a sustainable life for yourself personally, where you spend time with friends, you do things outside of work, you're living a healthy life, because I think otherwise you do lose your stamina. So, and the other thing I would say is learn public speaking. I think that the most important skill an entrepreneur has is actually public speaking, and that's a skill you can develop, and it will come in handy more than you know.
And you've seen that through lots and lots of pitch practicing here at 1736. So our startups in particular, they're tackling regulated, entrenched markets. Right? They're looking at things like transportation and energy and sustainability and education and healthcare. What sort of specific challenges do you think that entails? I mean, you're in a complicated market yourself, and you've been through a lot of those challenges. With that slant, what would you say in terms of dealing with that entrenched status quo when you're the disruptor coming into the market?
Well, I think that you have to respect your own constraints, the capacity constraints you have, and if you're in an industry that depends a lot on legislation and sort of a large incumbent sort of layer of businesses and standard practices and legislation, you're too small to really move that ship when you're young. And I think the best thing you can do is build a product whose force is so strong because of its adoption that you draw attention to it, and you make real for all these folks the potential of your idea. And then a lot of people try to come and stamp you out. But by then, you'll also have intrigued enough people who will be happy to help you go from there to the next step, which requires a lot more resources. And you have to hire a different set of people, develop a new set of muscles. But you first have to create the energy of the idea. Don't get too lost in the weeds of trying to change the law. I would really focus on making noise with your product. And then once you do that, you will attract bees like bees to honey. That's what I would do.
So you mentioned earlier the artist dashboard, the artist marketing platform. We've been doing some other pretty cool things around partnerships with artists, Thumb Movement's campaign, live streaming of Jack White concert. Talk a little bit about some of these great things that we see happening.
Yeah, well, it's really exciting for me as a musician to see this now, because we do have some more engineering capacity and we're developing more products, and AMP is one of them. We did a little campaign called Thumb Moments, which was really a fun idea where essentially someone would be using Pandora, and if they thumbed an artist, we would do this sort of one artist at a time. I think 5 or 6 different people, it was 8 or 10 people, when they thumbed the artist, immediately got a video Skype call onto their computer. And when it popped up, on the other end of the video Skype call was that artist, sitting in a chair and saying, hey, I'm gonna play a private concert for you. And played like a 3-song concert for the person sitting in front of their computer. And we get permission from them in this to film them, so you get to see the reaction. And it's amazing, that someone not a fan of the band. And we do it for listeners who've created a station with that artist, who have a clear affinity for them, for whom we know this will be particularly special. And also think this private 3-song concert out of nowhere, it's a big Easter egg. And that was really terrific. But I'll say that the thing that I find the most exciting is, we've done this quite a bit now, is we find a location, we'll pick a club, and it could be any city, we've done them all across the country. And then we find a band who we know has a pretty decent sized audience in that town. Not a big band, but it's sort of a working band. And we will set up an event where we'll invite people who thumbed up that band that live within driving distance of the club, and just put on this event. And it's like magic. You do this, and all of a sudden hundreds of people come from the neighborhood to a show without any other form of marketing. So we did this a long time ago with Amy Mann. It was one of the first ones we did at a club in LA. And Amy Mann is a singer-songwriter. She was Until Tuesday, had kind of a big sort of few years of really success with them, and then kind of went to a solo career, had some ups and downs, but pretty solid career, but not sort of a big broadcast radio artist anymore. And we talked with her about doing this, and her manager's like, okay, we'll give it a try. And they didn't expect anything at the club, and we got there, and she sat down. We said, we're gonna do a little kind of greeter table, and we just sit down and meet your fans. And it's like, okay, and there's nobody there. It's like 20 minutes before the show. She's sitting on the table, and we're like, oh. And then 10 minutes later, there was a line out the courtyard around the block to talk to her and sign her thing. The place was full. And when she walked on stage, that place went berserk. Because there was, there were 300 people packed to the rafters, and with just, these really enthusiastic Amy Mann fans who'd found like the Willy Wonka's gold ticket, for this special show that nobody else knew about. And our vision for this industry is to do that thousands of times a day, around the world eventually, where you're just spontaneously taking an audience and activating them locally in a very personal way with musicians. So, because I see that as really scalable,
And I can see the passion, the musician in you come out when you talk about those ideas. Clearly your foundation in being a musician in that world comes out.
Well, when I was in a band, we went from San Francisco and drove like 1,300 miles to Telluride and played for 12 people, And we got there an hour or two ahead of time and put flyers up on fucking telephone poles, That's what we had. And guess what? It didn't work out after 4 years, And and we would pass all the other bands, in their vans and trailers going across these like a bunch of fools, It was fun, sure, for a while, but there was so much talent. There was just like trees falling in the forest, all kind of circulating in these clubs with no mechanism for discovery, unless you got on broadcast radio, and that's the purview of a very small number of artists. So, a personal ambition of mine with Pandora is to get to a point where if you graduate college and you tell your mom and dad you want to be in a rock band like I did, instead of going, okay, 10 years of, financial support, they'll say, that's a good middle class life, son, go get them. Like, get on Pandora Amp, and it'll be more of a career. And when I was in my late 20s, and I'd been in a band for a while, I'd been a Manny and then in a band, and we were having some success at a local club level in the Bay Area, but it was not, it wasn't some meteoric rise. I still remember feeling very self-conscious that, I'm not making money, I don't have sort of a security in my chosen field, and more people, the people look at you like, well, when's this phase of your life going to end? When's it going to get back and get a real job and all that? And that's an enormous pressure. It's very hard to sustain your commitment to music. And I wondered to myself, like, what if what we could do could make it possible for, 25,000 bands to make a solid living playing music? If we did that, it would mainstream the profession. And I think that would have cultural impact here. Instead of it being kind of like a weird profession or like a fringe profession, it would be like being a teacher, and it would be respected. And if you do that, I think so much would accrue to the industry. It would just, it would become a virtuous cycle. So that's what we're looking to do.
And unlock probably some of the best talent, right? Because that democratization, we see the same thing happening with the startup revolution that's going on around the world, right? That some of the best ideas may not reside in Silicon Valley, to the same degree that some of the best musicians may not have access to traditional channels.
Yeah, I mean, there were some people who helped us with this company early on. We were paying them 20, 25 bucks an hour that had been in Duke Ellington's band. Like, that's fucked up. You're worth more than 20 bucks an hour, if you paid in Duke Ellington's band, but that's the nature of the beast, and music ought not to be that way.
So the story won't be complete without the what is it like to have an IPO, right? Many of our startups in the room wish that they would have that experience. So what was that like for you?
That was a rush. Yeah, I mean, we walked, I remember coming to Wall Street the day of the IPO and turning the corner, and they put some sign on the building that was like 100 feet tall. It was gigantic, Pandora sign. And it was surreal, like looking at this enormous thing on Wall Street. We definitely paused for a moment then and kind of appreciated that. I don't think that going public is the goal of what we're doing, but it was a serious milestone. Like, not that many companies get to that point. And that kind of, that marker was meaningful to us, and the whole company just had a really good day that day, celebrating that. The next day was like the rest. It was back to work, and the company really hasn't changed much since that point. But it was fun. It was very rewarding, and it was fun to see everybody else get to participate in that. Ultimately, I say this internally at Pandora, and I mean this, that of all things, that all the sort of satisfactions of being an entrepreneur, and in the case of Pandora, really having so many listeners and beginning to see its impact on musicians, that's all deeply rewarding. But nothing is more enduringly rewarding than having 1,500 people that get up on Monday morning with a smile on their face because they're going to work for a job that you created, and they're happy doing it. That is really a deep sense of satisfaction, and it's what sustains my enthusiasm for this. It's actually, I'm really excited about all the musician stuff and listener stuff, but I'm really excited about the culture, and when we get to be 3,000 employees having the same kind of place to work.
So what does the future look like for you? Where's forecast for us, both the industry and Pandora specifically? What can we look forward to?
Well, the plan is in the next couple of years, I'm going to rig the algorithm so my band starts to play everywhere. Get the band back together. Our view of the future is that we'll become global. Right now we're only in 3 countries, and I really can't wait to be in every country. And to really alter the way people consume music. Radio still represents 80% of the hours people spend with music. Even today, with all these newfangled on-demand services and portability and all those things, still, we just want to hit a button and have someone take care of it for us, which I understand. So if we can really impact radio, we're impacting kind of the main line of music consumption. So bring people back. And one of the most great parts of this, we get a ton of feedback from listeners. We get something like 100,000 emails a month from listeners. We answer them all with a personal reply. We have a team of people that do nothing but reply to emails. And the testimonials we get from folks using Pandora, astonish you. The level of kind of affection and enthusiasm and stuff, it's amazing, and we want to do that for years. Creative musicians, middle class. I think that we're on our way to doing that, like I said, and have it be global. That will be I think that we're on a path to do that. I can just see those dots connecting. And I think continuing to be a model company. Like I want Pandora to stand for good things, for people who work there to be proud of what we're doing, to have a sense of purpose and mission, and to be one of the healthy parts of the music industry, and sort of stand for good things. So a lot of work ahead.
That's wonderful. So much of what you said tonight I think resonates with our members and with the startups. We appreciate you coming and sharing the funny stories, the insights, the hindsights, and the forecasts about where things go. Appreciate the view that you have about the importance of your team and culture, and the importance of your customers, what you're trying to do for them, that there's a bigger purpose to what you're trying to do, because that ultimately cuts to the root of what we're doing with our members at 1776. The world has big challenges. Entrepreneurs, if they're very passionate and they execute well, hold the key to unlocking a lot of that. So thank you for coming out tonight. Won't you join me in thanking you? So come on and join us for more time with networking.
Thank you for your assistance, by the way. You have your own business?